My name is Allan. I'm working every day as a Secretary General of the European Youth Forum. So I'm an advocate for young people in Europe. It's a big organization, but before I joined that, for the past 7 years, I've worked a lot in education. I've been representing students, I've been dealing a lot with educational reform, and that is perhaps something I would like to talk to you today about. One of the things that has caught me a bit off ground recently is how I think profoundly our educational landscapes are shifting, and we don't often notice that. There's a really good book that I would invite you all to read perhaps after this, if you didn't already. It's by an American author called Martha Nussbaum. Her book is titled Not for Profit: Why Do We Need Humanities for Democracy? And in that book, she talks about a silent crisis, what is happening in our educational systems all across the world. You might think what she would describe is American, but it is actually what you can find here as well, and I'll bring a couple of examples. And I think that illustrates very much why we actually need to not do the kind of things that we are doing in education today. So let me go a bit into the specifics. She talks about a crisis in education which is largely unnoticed, but very damaging to our future and very damaging to our democratic countries, especially in Europe and the Western continent. What she's talking about is that in most cases, humanities, well, mostly referred to as arts and music, but also philosophy, are more and more seen as useless frills, something that we can afford to do when we're doing well economically, but not if we're in a crisis, not if what we actually need is an economic development, economic competition. And I think there's a lot of evidence to this if you look at what kind of educational changes are being made everywhere. I think there's a great paradox happening in our education. Never before have we expected our education to achieve so much for our societies and our human development and our economies than at this moment. But at the same time, all of us are more concerned than ever about its quality, and it's very widespread at the same time. So everybody's becoming a critic of education, which ironically I'm doing here now as well. But what is happening is illustrated by a couple of things. Let me ask you a question. Suppose you probably know the answer. So if you had 100 euros on your account, in your savings account, and if you would leave it there for 5 years, let's say, and it earns an interest rate of 2%, and you would be given a multiple choice question saying that, do you think after 5 years you've earned more, you would have more than 102 euros on your account, exactly 102 euros, or less than 102 euros? Now, would it be surprising if I told you that up to 1/3 of our highly educated population does not know the answer to that question? And in many cases, especially if we look at some demographics older than 50, it goes up to 60%. Now, that is a statistic that was gathered by the OECD when they are measuring financial literacy of people. And that is one of a very basic numeracy skill that is quite required in our economic development, yet our educational system does not give us the competence to know this in many cases. On the other hand, what we see in education is that more and more of the cost of education is being put on the student itself, for example. And if you look at the United States as an example, where you would expect people to be highly financially literate because they are expected to deal a lot with everyday finances, there you would see actually the student debt, which is a hugely and fastly growing part of the economy, is around 1.2 trillion euros, which is half of the economy of the UK, which is higher than credit card debt. And in that context, our educational system in a lower level has not provided all these students with very basic financial literacy skills. So when we go back to the notion of what is actually needed for democratic societies, I'm not only talking about arts and literature and philosophy, but it's also about basic skills that we need, which are numeracy and grammar, which used to be part of the liberal arts from way back when education started in ancient Greece. Liberal arts literally means that it's something which is needed for freedom. And the subjects that were taught then for you to be able to actually participate and decide as a citizen in the democracy of ancient Greece were also numeracy. They were also, of course, arts, ethics, logic, but also grammar. So you had very highly reflective themes and very basic sets of skills. Now, the other example, perhaps where we see where education is profoundly being changed in our policies is when you look at the discussion about employment. There's a figure, let's say it's around 17 million young people currently in Europe are in a rather precarious situation. Around 5 million of them are unemployed. Around 5 million more are going through internships one after another, and around 7 million young people are not in employment or in education. That's the size of the Netherlands. And that, where you see where policymakers are then saying more and more, and what kind of reforms are being done, that, oh, you need to align your educational systems better with the short-term needs of the economy, and what kind of jobs are out there. And I think that's an extremely dangerous paradigm that we have entered, but it's prevalent absolutely everywhere. You would see that, you know, where we talk about tuition fees, they're more and more correlated to your potential earning after graduation. We're seeing that a lot of those young people then do graduate because more and more people enter higher education, for example. Indeed, they don't find jobs, but that's not necessarily because the educational systems were bad, but that's actually often to do with the fact that we don't have investment in economy and job creation overall. And this all happens in a context in Europe where our populations are fastly aging. By 2050, the OECD and the EU statisticians predict that we will have one child lower than the age of 14 per each 3 retired persons, if the retirement age maintains as it is around 65 or a bit lower. It used to be that we had 2 children per 1 retiree. So there's been a profound shift which is happening now. And so we're seeing that a lot of people, a lot of young people, especially at our generation, cannot find jobs despite supposedly having the best education ever that has existed. So probably it's not only the educational system that is at play here, but what we do see is that those young people, in a way, are the ones that are supposed to actually make sure that in our demographic system we would be and remain a sustainable kind of environment where we can take care of the elderly. So there, I think, are fundamental questions about where we are placing young people that go through the education system. So coming back to the liberal arts and coming back to financial literacy within that, there is another figure. Recently, they started to look at correlation of whether you are financially literate to how much to how big your wealth is when you retire. And they say, it's the same studies from the OECD, that it's around 40% of wealth inequality can be explained by the fact that you didn't know how to calculate your interest rate, for example. So there is this big discourse happening that, okay, we need certain skills for the short-term needs at the labor market. And that, I think, is what exactly leads to cutting off of the humanities from our classrooms. So what I think should be done is that we should take 1.5% of our GDP and invest that into a liberal arts education, which is truly liberal arts, which means that the idea behind it is to build character. It's not to teach you facts, it's to teach critical thinking, to teach reflection, on top of the basic skills that you need to have, which are grammar and numeracy. And that could be done after we graduate from our secondary level of education. So what I'm talking about is that in the context where actually there are predictions that around 50% of the jobs that currently exist will be lost to automation. So basically there will be no low-skilled jobs available in the future. We need to have preparation for a very, very long period of uncertainty at the time when you would normally enter the labor market as a young person. So if our universities today cannot handle that, and if they're really targeting the short-term economic need, then perhaps we need to create a new level of education, which would be liberal arts. On average, our countries spend around 8,000 to 10,000 US dollars per student of public money a year for education, all levels of education combined. So if we would take that kind of an amount and put that into a new level of education, let's say a year of liberal arts for everyone, which is really about self-development, which is really about developing the critical thinking, after which you would start to specialize, which would perhaps enable to also actually make some other savings in the higher education sector by making that a bit shorter. That would only cost us around 0.5% of the GDP. So it's not a very big amount of our investment, considering that around 6% of GDP is put into education overall. But I think that if we start teaching and going back to the roots, we might have large yields of avoiding this kind of discontention between young people and societies. Because what we see, what happens if we're not prepared for the very long term, and a lot of young people are lost in the short term because of economic uncertainties, wrong policies, etc., they will become also inactive in our democracies. They will lose the critical mindset also there. They won't criticize tradition anymore. So that, I think there is a thing to be thought about there, is that our universities, in their expansion, losing that element of critical thinking, and if that is so, how we can remedy that. Of course, there are already a lot of developments in this, because the value, I think, of a degree is going to be seen differently and differently. Because if everyone achieves a certain level of education, then the one kind of distinction of one specific degree is very difficult to measure. So then it really all becomes about what you can do, demonstrating that and measuring that when you are actually being active at the labor market or as a community member. I think there are many opportunities here to rethink, but I think we have to look at the fact that indeed this crisis, for most of us, is something that we don't think about every day. It is a crisis. It is a crisis if we cut out arts and humanities, and in a number of cases you see governments actually cutting that out literally from funding for universities, or literally from the curriculum in the secondary education level. And I think that is very dangerous, because where you see new developments, new science and technology emerging, is at the verges where people actually do criticize tradition and think new. So perhaps we should think about a new educational level that will grant us all a new start. Thank you very much.